Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Preparing for the Aftershocks of COVID-19. My name is Mike Holman. I'm a VP Research here at Lux, so I help to manage our analyst organization, and I'll be presenting the webinar today. Before we dive in, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you do have any questions during the presentation, just enter them into the questions box on the screen. We will have time for a few questions at the end of the presentation. But before we get into that, just to share a little bit of background about Lux and who we are and what we do. Our mission is really to help our clients innovate smarter and grow faster, right? So do a better job of understanding the innovations and emerging technologies and how their organizations can take advantage of those to drive growth. And obviously COVID's had a big impact on that, so that's one of the things that we'll be getting into. But the core of the methodology and the approach that we have has really stayed the same. You know, at Lux, we start off looking at the mega trends that we see affecting these different industries and sectors. We have a lot of experts with technology backgrounds. Most of our researchers have advanced degrees in science and engineering, so really can understand how these trends are going to influence innovation. We then look at technologies. We do a lot of technology analysis driven both by that expertise and analyst insight, as well as data science and analytics to try to identify, you know, the fundamentals of which technologies are going to be the most promising in terms of creating new business opportunities, or the most important to pay attention to in terms of potential disruptive threats. And then we work at finding the right partners to help our clients capitalize on these areas. So we do a lot of primary research, you know, going out and talking to the startup companies and the other innovative organizations that are developing these new technologies to really get a good handle on who are the leaders and what are the key developments in these spaces. You know, and as I've said, a lot of that has the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely shaken up a lot of that. So we've been spending a lot of time over the last several months working with clients and understanding on how they can prepare for the aftermath of the pandemic, right? So there's obviously still a lot of challenges that organizations are facing and working through, but understanding what the future beyond the pandemic is going to be and how to position and prepare for that is, you know, it's really becoming the time for a lot of organizations to think about and understand that. And that's really the focus of the presentation for today. And the agenda is just to tee up briefly what we're seeing from probably doesn't need too much introduction, but to talk about the impact that we're seeing from the pandemic and why we do think it's setting us up for a rather different looking future. I want to spend some time stepping through and identifying the impact that's going to have on different technologies, and then talk about how we apply that, right? How you prioritize your efforts for that post-COVID-19 future once we have the vaccine, and what is that new landscape going to look like, and how to best take advantage of it. So to talk about the impact, I mean, this is one of the questions we get all the time from clients when something notable or unexpected happens in the world. We always get questions like, well, what's the impact of this event going to be on renewable energy, on self-driving cars, on any number of different innovation areas? We've certainly heard that about COVID, but this is a different order of impact, and I think there's two charts that really briefly illustrate that. You know, the first has been the impact on the price of oil. see, it's been very volatile over the last couple of decades, but the impact and the drop off to even negative oil prices briefly in certain markets is a pretty drastic and unprecedented change. And similarly, the impact, and this is U.S. statistics, but you've seen a lot elsewhere, of the economic impact of 30 million unemployment claims in just a few weeks. So you could take this chart all the way back to the Great Depression, and there's still nothing like what we've seen during this pandemic. And so the upshot of this is that given the scale of the disruption that we've seen here, we're not going back to normal, right? We're certainly not going back to the old normal. There's going to be a very different looking new normal after the pandemic. And, as much as many organizations are still facing those challenges, now is really the time to position and prepare for that, because the aftermath is coming, and it's going to be necessary to be ready for that new competitive landscape when we're coming out of this, and it requires organizations to plan and prepare for that now. And so that's a lot of the conversations that we've been having over the last couple months, is increasingly oriented towards preparing for that new normal. So how do we go about doing that? I mean, there's a lot of approaches that you've seen out there, I'm sure, for talking about the impact of COVID on this or that technology, right? You can find somebody who's an expert on wearable electronics, or expert on precision agriculture, and get them to tell you to talk about what they think the impact of COVID on that technology area is going to be. And that can certainly be very valuable to hear if it's a smart expert and there's somebody who's plugged in. But when, for us at Lux, we cover a wide range of different technology and innovation areas, and many of our clients are pretty large, diversified, multinational companies who have businesses that and interests in a lot of different areas and a lot of different technology spaces. So it's important to try to take a more systematic approach rather than sort of just doing this for each technology one by one. So the approach that we've taken here is to, first of all, identify the key underlying trends that are going to change as a result of the coronavirus, and then use those trends as a framework to kind of systematically and consistently assess the technology impact sort of across the whole portfolio of technologies that we're covering, or that your organization is following. And then you can put that together, the trends and the technology impact, to really understand how your industry is going to be affected, and the right way to prioritize actions and response. So let's start off with identifying those key underlying trends. And we've settled on and identified 5 key trends that we think are going to really define, again, how that post-COVID future is going to be different than the past. And I'll just give a brief introduction to each of them here. So first of all, infection prevention, obviously that's really important right now during the outbreak, but a lot of the habits that people have developed, whether it's around PPE or diagnostic testing, are things that are going to be carried forward even beyond the current crisis. Similarly, we're obviously all doing a lot of remote commerce, right? Which we say which we consider any approach to using technology to provide some service or some product remotely that used to be done in person. And again, this won't all be as necessary once we have a vaccine as it is in many places right now, but the capabilities that are built up and the comfort level, on the vendor and supplier side, and the comfort level with these solutions on the consumer side is going to mean that these are used more in the aftermath of the pandemic than they were before. From a bit bigger picture perspective, one of the most striking impacts for, frankly, both individuals and for businesses has been the supply chain disruptions that we've experienced as a result of the pandemic. And there's going to be a greater strategic priority on improving resiliency to that type of disruption, whether that's a greater focus on localized production, deglobalization, or whether that's technologies and processes that can provide, kind of greater visibility and robustness to the global supply chain. We also see businesses placing in the future a greater priority on agility. Right, a lot of companies have had to pivot very quickly and very dramatically in some cases as a result of these impacts, and they're going to want to have both technologies and capabilities as well as business processes in the future that make them more flexible and adaptable to deal with future crises as a result of that experience. And then finally, obviously, the macroeconomic impacts are going to be important. The working out the demand shortfall, the commodity price changes that we talked about, the availability of risk capital. These are all going to last beyond the immediate crisis and are going to have an impact on the prospects and development path for a lot of different technologies and businesses. So these are the major trends that we see defining that post-COVID opportunity. Now let's, like I said, use those as a framework to assess the impact on different technology areas here. And the way we've been doing that is with the structure that's kind of shown in this chart here at right, where we take each of those 5 trends and for a given technology, assess what the impact of each trend on that technology is going to be. Using these sort of sliders here, right? Is it going to have overall a positive impact, negative impact? It's going to be neutral, and to what degree? And as you can see, the chart will also show you the time frame for the impact. It's indicated by the color of the dot. Is this primarily going to be a near-term impact, or is it more medium-term or long-term? Defined as near-term, next 12 months or so, medium-term within the next 3 years, longer term out to 5 years and beyond. And then the scale of that impact, right, is that going to be a minor one for this trend on this technology, moderate or major? And so you can see this sort of puts everything together so you can get a sense, think through this systematically and get a sense of what the overall balance of these different and sometimes conflicting trends are likely to be in terms of influencing the development path of that technology over time as a result of this pandemic. So a couple of examples of that just to kind of illustrate this. So we've applied this to dozens of different technologies that Lux covers, but to just show a couple here. I think a really interesting one to look at is telemedicine. And this is something that we've seen naturally as a result of primarily the infection prevention and remote commerce trends has gotten a big boost in the crisis. Obviously, people aren't able to or don't want to go into hospitals and doctors' offices in many cases. So we've seen both the infrastructure development and the regulatory changes that are needed to enable more telemedicine, more of these medical services to be provided remotely. And that genie's not going to go back in the bottle, right? The regulations aren't likely to change back, and consumers and providers are going to want to continue using these solutions. But I think you can also, one of the benefits of using this framework is you can kind of think through some of the other impacts here as well. And beyond that sort of near to medium term, I do think the potential of these solutions to improve, in particular, the resiliency of the healthcare system in the longer term, right? To bring services, more services and specialists to rural clinics, and and help to balance the resources throughout the healthcare system to bring them to bear where patients need them most. The ability of these to really improve resiliency is going to help to continue to pull telemedicine forward and to have not just the near term, but a significant ongoing impact. So for companies in this, in the healthcare industry, pharmaceutical players and so on, really do need to think about how to incorporate telemedicine into their strategies, even in many cases where it is maybe not a good fit with their current business models. So another area that has kind of a little bit more of a mixed impact, or telemedicine was a pretty clearly positive impact. A more of a mixed impact is in plastic waste recycling. So this has been an area that's been really hot. One of the probably topics we've gotten the most questions about over the last couple of years, really, and understanding how this pretty significant trend is going to be impacted by the pandemic is an important question for a lot of organizations. So we overall are going to see some disruption in sort of the near to medium term here, where a lot of the, especially more emerging, more advanced plastic recycling solutions still need a lot of funding for technology development, and definitely, especially in more developed economies, need a lot more investment in just building out capacity and infrastructure as well, because formerly a lot of this was done by exporting plastic waste to China, which has not been happening anymore. So there's a pretty significant disruption for this, and again, in that near to medium term, but we see a really strong positive impact from, again, particularly that resiliency trend, right? Because as organizations and companies are looking, and governments are looking to improve local resiliency and local reliance, not everywhere obviously not every geography, every country has access to lots of fossil fuel resources, but virtually everywhere has access to lots of plastic waste. So if you have these technologies that can convert that plastic waste into to valuable products locally, that has a big benefit in terms of that resiliency, and that's going to be a long-term driver for innovations in plastic waste recycling. So this is going to be an area that's challenged in the near term, but there's going to be significant upside for companies that are able to stick with it and to lay that groundwork to capitalize on the emerging future demands. So as I said, I could go through a lot more examples, pardon me, in terms of the plastic waste, in terms of the technology impacts here. But let's turn and think more about what you want to do about it and how to apply these technology impacts to your industry. So as we think about how to prioritize industry action, what I like to do is kind of flip this framework, flip the axis on the framework a little bit here, and look at how we see the impact on a given technology changing over time as we proceed from that near term to mid-term to long term. How is the impact going to shift? And when you layer that technology impact together, layer those impacts of different technologies that are affecting a given industry, that helps to create an overall picture of and an overall roadmap for changes in that industry. And again, this is something we've applied to a number of different industry segments. The one that I think is maybe interesting to use as a case study here is automotive. So here, there's obviously a lot of changes and a lot of technologies that have been reshaping the automotive industry that are going to be affected by this pandemic. And autonomy is a good example of that, right? So there's a lot of push for self-driving cars. That's something that's going to be slowed down in the near term because of the limitations on development work and trials, but is going to have a stronger pull in the long term as that sort of social distancing and infection prevention concern, as well as the impact for shared mobility companies, makes the technology more important in the future. Now, in contrast, electrification is sort of the other major trend we see in the industry, and that's one that, while there's also going to be some disruption to it in the near term, we don't see really being changed in the long run by the pandemic, because that's really much more driven by the fundamental economics and the regulatory picture in particular. In contrast, though, there's also some operational technologies that are going to have a very different outlook in the future. Right, there's a lot of interest right now as companies are getting factories back up and running safely and using technologies like augmented reality and wearables that can enable, so worker monitoring and remote guidance to help reopen safely. But as companies see the efficiency and cost-saving benefits these technologies can also bring, that's going to be more of a sustained impact, where there is going to be more of a positive pull for these in the future and in the longer term as well. And then, naturally, in terms of product innovation, something like antimicrobial coatings and treatments, something that a lot of automotive companies are taking a very close look at right now, and are seeing a lot of consumer demand for. So Ford Motor Company is one example of that, but a lot of clients we've heard from, and not just automotive, but many industries are really looking at antimicrobial coatings. And while there's definitely some technical challenges with getting those to work and with durability and application, that's clearly an area where there's going to be a stronger demand for some time to come. So to put these technologies together and kind of create that overall picture of the impacts on the automotive industry, we don't see, despite some short-term disruption, a long-term shift or a longer-term change in that shift to electrification in terms of powertrains. We do see a sustained impact and change in a lot of these operational technologies in manufacturing that will have some lasting benefits for the industry. And on the product side, technologies, whether it's antimicrobials or autonomy and self-driving that can enhance customer comfort and safety, are going to be even more important innovation priorities for the industry. So again, just a taste here of how we see these trends that are going to shift the post-COVID landscape, impacting technologies, and how those technology changes are going to impact industries overall. Helps to, again, create that systematic approach to evaluating these impacts, and gives you a framework to really start planning for taking advantage of and being well positioned for those opportunities. Once we have a vaccine and once we begin moving into this post-COVID world. Just a few thoughts to sum up here in terms of the key takeaways. Again, we certainly see and expect a very different new normal, and the need to be rigorous and systematic about planning for that in order to make sure your organization is well positioned. I think right now that also implies that innovation is really more important than ever, because your organization is going to be emerging after the pandemic into a very different reality, very different world. So there's a lot of change and a lot of innovation that needs to be happening right now in order to be prepared for that. At the same time, I do think it's also important to not lose sight of some of these kind of key underlying long-term trends that predated the pandemic and that will be maintained or even accelerated by it. So electrification and automotive was one example of that. but I think a lot of trends related to things like sustainability, consumer choice, and personalization. Some of these key mega trends are not going away just because of the crisis either. So understanding what's going to stay the same as well as what's going to change is going to be important. So thanks to everyone for your attention here. We do have some time to take a few questions on the presentation. Looking at what's come in, so there's a question about the oil and gas industry. If we have any insights on what's likely to happen there, I think that's a really good question. When we've gotten a lot of had a lot of really interesting discussions around, because I do think oil and gas is one of the industries that is going to be the most highly impacted. I mean, as you saw from the oil price chart that I showed near the beginning there, we really see oil and gas kind of getting pushed into a couple of, pushed in a couple of different directions. Like, these companies really have a choice to make. And they're put to that choice by that low oil price, by the lack of resources and profitable cash flow that they have to invest. These companies really have to make a decision. Do you want to double down and invest in staying in that hydrocarbons business? There might be some adaptations to that. Perhaps, you stay well integrated and continue investing in exploration and production, but also, look for maybe some different downstream markets, maybe integrating downstream into petrochemicals production. We do expect to see more investments in things like crude to chemicals that allow oil and gas companies to do that. But I think I think a lot of the, companies that have access, to obviously many of the national oil companies and some of the international ones that have access to lower cost production assets are going to take that route. But many others, and I think particularly, the oil and gas companies in Europe and other places, are going to take a different strategy of really taking the opportunity to double down on the energy transition and shift the investments much more aggressively into renewables and becoming electricity producers instead of oil and gas production. So that's something that will be you'll see a lot of, and I think you're already starting to see a lot of companies doing as well. So there's really a choice of one or two paths for oil and gas, and different companies are going to have to make a strategic decision about what the right path for them is. Finally, we have time for maybe one more question here. So someone asked about if we're seeing changes in the flows of funds into startups from venture capital firms, and I think that's a great point. That's really one of the macroeconomic impacts that we've been seeing as well. Is there's definitely a greater degree of risk aversion due to the economic impact, right? A lot of venture capitalists are inclined more to keep their powder dry to help, anticipating that existing portfolio companies are going to have a longer path to market because of the tougher economic conditions, and they might need more capital to get to profitability, to get to an exit. And in general, given the economic uncertainty, that is leading to challenges and riskier startup companies being funded. So there's a general concern, I think, about what that means for the innovation landscape, but it's also potentially an opportunity for some of the large companies in these areas that may have a bit stronger balance sheets. There's an opportunity. There's really a need there's going to be a lot of startup companies that are going to be struggling to raise funding. There's going to be a need for them to engage with partners and to explore alternate sources of funding, in order to keep what may be some very viable and valuable technologies alive. And there'll be an opportunity to engage probably on more favorable terms. So I think looking at which startup companies are, and that's something we've worked with a number of clients on, is analyzing which startup companies are likely to be needing to raise funds in the next 3 to 6 months, and should those be organizations that you target for partnerships or investment right now. So there is a challenge, but also I think a real opportunity there for large companies that want to place some bets during the downturn that may help them pay off in the longer run. So yeah, I think that's all the time we will have for today. If you do have any questions afterwards about the content or about Lux, you can send a note to that address you see on the screen here, questions@luxresearchinc.com, and someone will get back to you. If you submitted a question that we didn't have time for, we will reach out to you about that. You can follow us here on LinkedIn, on Twitter, follow our blog, luxresearchinc.com for more insights and information from the Lux team. But thanks again to everyone for your attention, and have a great day.